now got our list of albums rendered on the screen, all the albums we got back from the JSON endpoint, but we did get a little bit of a warning message down here, something about a key property. So this is a little bit of a gotcha with React. Whenever we show components that are in an array, and that is exactly what we're doing here with the render albums method, we are producing an array and rendering it inside of our JSX here. Each component inside of that array must have a key property associated with it. The whole purpose of this is just for performance concerns. It's how React makes sure that as it re-renders a list of components, it is intelligently re-rendering or updating a very particular component. So to fix it, I'm going to place my JSX on a new line just to give myself a little bit of space. And then inside of the text tag, I'm going to add on a key property. And the key property here is what React is going to use to figure out which item in the list it is updating at any given time. So the only requirement of this key property is that it must be unique against all the other elements in the array. And number two, we also must make sure that it is the same value across re-renders of the list. So a common mistake to make is to say, oh, well, I'll just use the index of this album within the array. That is not something that's guaranteed to be consistent across re-renders, and so it's not really appropriate for use as a key. In this case, we're working with a list of albums. Each title is actually kind of sufficiently randomized, or unique, so I will use a key of the album's title. On actual applications, by far the best property used for a key is if your resource has an ID associated with it. So you can just use a key of the record's ID right here. In this case, our albums do not have an ID, so we don't get the benefit of that. All right, let's refresh. And it looks like the error went away, so everything is fantastic now. So back to what we were working on. Right now we have the name property, or title property of each album displayed, but that, not too useful, not at all. We want to see a lot more detail related to each album. So as I mentioned previously, we will create a new component called album detail. An album detail is going to take one album as a prop or property, and it's going to render a lot of information about that single album. So in this section, we're going to start working on this new album detail component. Remember the process we go through. Anytime we make a new component, we make a new file. So in my components directory, I will make a new file, and I'm going to call it albumdetail.js. And then inside of here, we will put down our boilerplate. So I will import React from React. And I will import both view and text from React Native. Now this is something where I'm going to start asking you ahead of time whenever we start creating a component whether or not this needs to be a class-based component or a functional component. In this case, for the album detail, we have something that is just showing some data to the user. It is solely a presentational component. And so I think that this can stand to be just a functional component because we do not need lifecycle methods and we do not need to get access to state. So I will define my functional component, and then I will export it as by default. Cool. So now the last thing I want to do before we go too far here, I want to go back to my album list and just import it over there so we've got it nice and ready to make use of. So back inside of album list, I will import the album detail, and now we need to consider what the what the relative path to that file is. Well, it's in the same directory this time. Album list is in the same directory as album detail. So I will say in the current directory / give me album detail. Cool. Finally, inside of render albums right here, I don't really want to be showing any text anymore. I want to show an album detail. So I'm going to replace the text tag with album detail, like so. Okay, so this is looking good, but now let's consider kind of like the next challenge here. I'm showing many album details. I want to show one album detail per album. That means that I need to somehow communicate from this parent component, album list, down into the child component, the album detail, hey, I want you to show this very particular album. Okay, we need to do some communication there. So if you recall, to do communication from a parent to a child, we make use of the props system in React. So I want to pass the album down to album detail as a prop. So no longer do I want to try to show any album.title here, because this is no longer a text tag. So I'm going to take that out. Now that I am not passing in any text in here or anything like that, I should be making this a self-closing component. So I'm going to remove the closing tag over here, and I'm going to make this into a self-closing component by adding in a / right before the closing bracket. Finally, I need to pass down this album as a prop to album detail. Okay, I need to pass it down as a prop. So whenever I want to pass a prop, I'll write out the name of the prop equals, and then inside of braces, I will list the variable that I want to pass down to the child. So album is album. Now inside of the album detail, I will have a prop of props.album, and that will be equal to my album. One thing I want to point out in great detail here, I'm going to point out several times, is that the name of the props, very much like the name of the state that we were working with earlier, is completely arbitrary. I do not have to call this thing right here, I do not have to call this album just because the variable is also called album. There is absolutely no tie between the property name and the variable. So this, instead of album, I could call it like record. And now inside of album detail, I would refer to props.record. Or it can be it could be like data. I don't know, anything we want. So just to make sure that it's really clear, the name of the variable up here does not have to match the name of the prop. It just ever so happens that with a lot of the code that I write, they generally end up as being the same. Cool, so this is looking pretty darn good. I think that in this component, album list, we are no longer making use of the text tag anymore up top. So I'm going to remove that text tag just to keep our imports nice and clean, make sure we're not importing anything that we don't need. Then, just to make sure that everything works a-okay, I'm going to flip back over to the album detail, and let's consume that prop that we just added. Okay, let's make sure that we're actually making use of that album. So inside of my album detail component, I'm going to return some amount of JSX. I'm going to suggest we return a view tag, and inside of that, I'll show some text. So I want to show, again, just to keep the implementation we had before without the album detail equal to what it is now with the album detail. I want to show just the name or the title of the album. So I need to receive the prop that we passed down from album list inside of album detail. So I'm going to receive my props object. On that props object, I will have access to props.album.title. And remember, it is specifically album that I'm making reference to here, because inside of album list, when I rendered the album detail, I said, hey, pass down this thing as a prop called album. All right. So this is looking pretty good. The only warning we have here, again, is because I'm returning some amount of JSX, or all I'm doing out of this fat arrow function is returning something. So it's saying, hey, if you're just returning something, don't use the curly braces with the return keyword. Again, purely stylistic. We are going to add in some other code inside of here in a future section. So for right now, I'm just going to kind of leave it as it is. Let's refresh our simulator and make sure everything is still working. So I'll refresh the simulator. And yep, we still got our list of albums appearing on the screen. So this looks perfect. We have now refactored our text tag inside of the album list to instead use this album detail component. Let's continue the next section and focus on making this album detail look a lot better than how it already looks.